In January 1989, US President Ronald Reagan addressed his nation as he prepared to leave the White House at the end of his second term. His speech crested on a line he'd borrowed from John Winthrop, 17th century Puritan settler and eventual governor of the colony then known as Massachusetts Bay. This was the idea of America as a shining city on a hill, a beacon of liberty. 1989 turned out to be quite the apparent vindication of American leadership. By the end of it, the Berlin Wall that Reagan had memorably instructed Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to dismantle was indeed gone, a barrier that had helped imprison half a continent, being sold off in chunks as novelty paperweights. The Cold War was over, and for the next few decades the Western sphere submitted, obediently if not always cheerfully, to the American hegemon. But despite appearances, the United States has always had mixed feelings about its global role. As far back as the inaugural address of the United States' third president in 1801, Thomas Jefferson, for it was he, spoke of a desire for honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. In much more recent decades, even before the election of the United States' 45th and 47th president, Donald Trump, American politicians and voters had grown increasingly vexed that their various foreign interventions, all of them expensive, dangerous and difficult, had accrued little reward and received little thanks. President Trump's isolationist instincts have been manifest not just in an aversion to large-scale military deployments, but in a dramatic drawing down of American soft power outreach, gutting the programs and agencies designed to promote the US abroad. What direction would the Western world take if America wasn't leading it? Is the place it has led us to, arguably, a dead end? And if the US doesn't want the job, who does? This is the Foreign Desk.
We're so dependent on the security from the United States that basically we just ignore certain change in the thinking that comes from Washington.
America First is not a rallying call for an alliance. And I think that the Europeans are now realising that they're going to have to develop their own soft power principles, and there's no reason why they can't do it.
China, because of its economic success, can also say, look at Western democracies, they're a mess, they're failing. If you want success, look at our system.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our first guest is Gabrielius Landsbergis, Lithuanian politician and diplomat who served as Lithuania's Minister of Foreign Affairs from December 2020 until November 2024. Gabrielius, if we think back over the last decade and a bit, so back to the first election of President Donald Trump in 2016, how nerve-wracking has that period been for Eastern Europe?
I think that Eastern Europe is not admitting the certain facts and in full denial, and it's different than many Western countries. I'm not sure whether that's observed, especially for our Western European friends, let's say, in a way that we're so dependent on the security from the United States that basically we just ignore certain change in the thinking that comes from Washington.
And was there an amount, do you think, of wishful thinking, especially in recent years? Because your period as foreign minister coincided almost exactly with the presidency of Joe Biden, in between the two Trump presidencies. Did you get a lot from your fellow European leaders of people thinking, well, thank God that's over and we don't have to worry about it again? Yeah,
I mean, I think that one of the problems that appear, the way that we look at our friends in the United States, is that we tend to look at them through the lens of elections. Right? So it's Trump, it's Biden, Trump, Obama. But if you look historically, the change in the US posture when it comes to Europe has been happening for a while now. And probably that's not just the way that Americans see Europeans, but the Americans, the way that they see themselves portraying power in the world globally, meaning that they probably came to an understanding that they are overextended, that they cannot continue the same way being the policemen of the world that they have been thinking that they can previously. And I tried to pinpoint that point in history where probably this has happened. And that, I mean, others might have other ideas, but I thought that the peak of American and Western power was 2008, just before the financial crisis hit the world. And I choose the geopolitical point, the Bucharest meeting, the Bucharest NATO summit, where we extend NATO invitation, not in exactly in the same words, but basically mentally, to Ukraine and to Georgia. So we have redrawn NATO's map all the way to South Caucasus, to Georgia, right, encompassing the whole Black Sea. Now it sounds fantastical, even. Right. So, who would dare to do such a move? And we did that. Right. And we didn't even think that it's outrageous. Kind of sounded rather logical. Russia's weak, and we need to secure those who are, pro-Western, democratic, and we need to make sure that they're safe. The same way that, Baltics were secured. And we extended. And from there on, unfortunately, we rolled most of the things back.
Because to bring this question back to the sharp end, i.e. the Baltic states, how defendable actually are they without a US/NATO security guarantee?
Well, yeah, it's difficult to defend Baltic states without the United States. It's difficult. I mean, of course, it depends on, what would happen, right? So we need to create a scenario. But in most scenarios that the leaders of our countries are thinking of, they involve not just the defense of the United States, but basically a deterrent factor. That we are basing our security, not that, that there will be thousands and hundreds of thousands of American troops flocking in to defend, Narva or Vilnius or whatever, but the Russians would not want to test the American guarantees.
But I guess for the purposes of what we're trying to figure out in this program, i.e. if America doesn't do this, then who will, is Europe capable theoretically, if it decided it wanted to be, of providing an equally formidable deterrent?
Yeah, absolutely. Theoretically, it can. There is no doubt, right? So I'll give you one example. So now we are talking about, certain pieces of equipment that Europe, we just don't have it, right? So, for example, take Patriot anti-aircraft missiles and batteries, right? So the equipment itself. Long-range anti-air missiles are only produced in United States. So I had the conversation with an expert, and I've asked, okay, so is this really that difficult for Europe to be able to produce this sort of equipment? And he said that basically it's a couple of years. If we were to put our minds and money to it, Europe has everything. Rocket scientists, engineers, everything. We could be doing that. We choose not to because we believe that it's still okay. We don't have to, right? We have other places where to spend our money. So it's not about the inability. It's about the choice and the assessment of what needs to happen, in the first place.
Is this because the way Europe is organized, that it is a bunch of sovereign states with, centuries of history of not agreeing with each other?
Exactly. The Europe has been formed for cooperation within and outside. Now we are in a clear age of confrontation. We have to confront Russia. In some cases, we might have to confront the United States. I'm sure that we'll have to confront China. The world is, confrontational. And the biggest history that Europe isn't. We're still in the same mindset. Let's talk. And talking is good, but you still have to carry some sort of a stick.
But is it possible for Europe to assert itself in that way? Because it has struck me that as a soft power entity, it undervalues itself. And I know I don't need to explain this to somebody from Eastern Europe or anywhere in the former Soviet sphere, where you will often see the European flag hoisted even in countries which are not members of the European Union. I was in Chisinau recently, and the European flag flies off the front of the Parliament Presidency building the same size as the Moldovan flag. It is seen as an aspiration in a way I don't think a lot of Europeans really appreciate. Is there something there it could build on if the United States doesn't want to do it?
Well, you mentioned one specific country, and there are more of those where European appeal is probably the best seen and felt. So there are three countries like that. So it's Moldova, that's Ukraine, clearly, and now, recently, very much evident is Georgia.
Mm.
The country that I mentioned, talking about 2008, where basically, for almost a year, you would have every single day protests in the main street of Tbilisi, protesters waving European flags because they want to be part of EU. That is a strong symbol. And I don't think that we ourselves appreciate what it actually means, that we created something that is rather strong. It's symbolic. We undervalue it ourselves.
I just want to come back finally to a point you touched on, and this was the European, well, not the European Union necessarily, because there's more to Europe than that, but Europe in relation to China. And China was an entity with which you picked a couple of squabbles yourself while you were foreign minister. But is there a gap there for Europe as well? If the next bipolar world is going to be the United States and China, should Europe be asserting itself as an equal to either of those?
Well, Europe can have enough power to squeeze in, let's say, right? I still have belief that if there would be a confrontation between China and United States, that Europe would see itself aligning more to United States, because we want democratic country to win. I mean, and I'm not talking necessarily about the military confrontation, right? It could be economic or whichever. But basically the world that the West created under US leadership has benefited all of us immensely. And what we're seeing right now is it might be a hiccup, it might be a longer period, we don't know. US has been in these periods before the Second World War, before the First World War, it's not exactly the new thing. But meaning looking forward, I would very much like us, the West, leading the next century as well.
That was Gabrielius Landsbergis, former Minister of Foreign Affairs for Lithuania. This is the Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our next guest is Edward Lucas, Times columnist and Senior Fellow at the Centre for European Policy Analysis. Edward, we've spoken elsewhere in this episode of Ronald Reagan's invocation of the image of the United States as a shining city on a hill. In the post-World War II decades, has the rest of the Western world necessarily seen it that way?
I think it depends very much where you are. If you are in divided Berlin, as I was as a student in the 1980s, then the United States really does seem like the beacon of liberty. And you remember the Berlin airlift and the crisis at Checkpoint Charlie, and you know that it's only really the American nuclear deterrence and the American military presence in Europe that's keeping you safe and free. If you live in Indonesia, Africa, Latin America, it looks very different. And so memories of the Cold War vary sharply depending on which part of the world you're in.
If we think about how various actual American statespeople would have regarded this decision over those decades, would they have seen the United States themselves deep down where they lived as this beacon of liberty, or just as a cover for self-interest?
Well, of course, it depends which. I think if one takes, for example, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is the subject of a biography by my near namesake, Ed Luce, that's just come out. He was from Poland originally and saw the world very much through the sort of moral contest, East-West contest with communism. And he was in no doubt that it was the United States' job to contain and ultimately reverse the communist grip on Eastern Europe. I think if you talk to his sparring partner, Henry Kissinger, he saw it in a rather more transactional way of make the world safe for America. And there's rather less ideology, or at least less sort of altruistic ideology there. And of course, when you're lucky, these things coincide. And what's good for America is good for freedom. And if you want freedom, then America's on your side. But that doesn't apply all over the world. So if you're the victim of a Latin American death squad, or living in Mobutu's Zaire, or the subject of the extraordinary crackdown on communists in Indonesia, which hundreds of thousands of people died, then it does look very different.
I want to go back to that point you were making of seeing this from the perspective of West Berlin during the Cold War, absolutely surrounded by a Soviet client state, and an obvious possible flashpoint were the Cold War to turn hot. If you reflect on that period, does it strike you that the Cold War goes very differently for Europe if the United States decides in the 1950s, you know what, we've done enough in 2 world wars, Europe can look after itself?
The United States always feels it's done enough. And right back to the founding of NATO, the United States were worried that Europeans were enjoying security on the US taxpayer dime. And every American president since Eisenhower has complained that the Europeans aren't doing enough. But in the end, it's in America's interest to have Europe free and prosperous. It's also in America's interest to have Europe as a sort of junior ally. And that fundamental truth of power politics has overcome any American resentment or reluctance about shouldering the burden, because in the end, if you pay the piper, you call the tune. And for decades, America has paid the piper and has called the tune. That may be changing now under Trump, and I'm not sure that the Americans are completely ready for the idea of 500 million Europeans with a 20 trillion GDP making their own decisions about what they want, and not necessarily playing second fiddle to the United States.
Because on that thought, and obviously one of the reasons we're doing this show is that relationship appears to be shifting between the United States and Europe, is there an argument that during the post-Cold War decades in particular, America's Western allies have been perhaps too keen to submit to its leadership, to follow it, most obviously into misadventures like Iraq?
On the whole, I would say that the transatlantic relationship has worked pretty well for both. It's never been perfect. There was never a golden age, but the Americans got the advantage of being a hegemon, and the Europeans got the advantage of being protected. But I think that train has pretty much hit the buffers under Donald Trump.
Going back to that thought of your Europeans in particular being a willing part of that American hegemon, is there an argument that as well as perhaps too often following American leadership, they have equally too often sat around waiting for American leadership? I'm thinking at this point particularly of the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, about which Europe faffed and fiddled for many years before the United States took decisive action.
I think there's always a tension between the sort of complacency and inactivity on one side, and which leads to the need for the Americans to come in and intervene. But there's also a strand of possibly of irresponsibility on the European side. And of course, it was the very enthusiastic support of the West Germans, and particularly Hans-Dietrich Genscher, for the breakup of Yugoslavia, which created the problem that we then needed the Americans to come in and solve. And one could also, I think, argue that the problems we now have with Russia are much more the result of European greed, naivety and complacency than they are of American neglect. The Europeans jumped into the trough in the 1990s. They shut their eyes to all the bad things that were visible even then about Russia. And now in the 2020s, we are dealing with a revanchist imperialist with a war machine running on steroids, and we're finding that's rather hard to cope with, and hoping that, and then blaming Trump for not being the kind of American president we wish for. So I think the Europeans are both the authors of their misfortune and also often unable to deal with the misfortune they create.
Just finally, we've been talking mostly, I guess, about American leadership as manifested through hard power. But how much of an absence will it create if Donald Trump's administration is as serious as it appears to be about withdrawing in terms of American soft power, thinking especially of the astonishing gutting of various aid programs, various education programs, broadcasting outlets around the world, etc.?
I don't think Europeans habitually tune into Voice of America, and they're not habitually consumers of American foreign aid. But I do think that the sort of very brutal public disavowal of American values, or what used to be American values, has gone down very badly in Europe. And one can argue that it was a sentimental belief and that Europeans should have been much more clear-eyed about America. But it's really hard now, if you say I'm a passionate Atlanticist as a European, well, what do you actually believe in? We know what Trump believes in, but that's the MAGA, Make America Great Again, is a hard project for foreigners to support. You can say we'd like to transplant that and do that in our country. But America First is not a rallying call for an alliance, whether it's an alliance of hard power or an alliance of soft power. And I think that the Europeans are now realizing that they're going to have to develop their own soft power principles, and there's no reason why they can't do it. They're big enough and rich enough. There's nothing stopping them except their own lack of political leadership.
That was Edward Lucas, Senior Fellow at the Centre for European Policy Analysis. Thanks for joining us. This is The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Finally on today's show, if the United States doesn't want to rule the world anymore, and Europe may not be quite up to the job, there is one other obvious candidate for the role. Joining me now is Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue and a visiting professor at King's College London's Lau Institute. Isabel, that big question first. Does China actually want to rule the world?
China doesn't want to rule the world in the way that the United States has ruled the world. It doesn't want, for example, to be the global policeman. It doesn't want to feel obliged or expected to intervene in situations around the world the way the US has done since 1945. So in that sense, no, it doesn't want to rule the world. The sense in which it does want to rule the world is that it wants to be able to set the conditions for trade, for economy, for security, for resources that suit China, and to really neutralize any challenge, particularly from the United States, but also from countries that are seen as allies of the United States or alliances that the United States is part of.
Does China actually kind of live in fear of the United States stepping back and perhaps obliging it to take a more direct role? Because China has obviously benefited enormously, whether they would admit it or not, from the order that the United States has upheld.
China absolutely has benefited, and it's benefited in many ways from the US security umbrella. I think the concern now, though, is that given that the US has said in terms that one of its ambitions is to slow or stop the rise of China, so that kind of moment where China could just enjoy a relatively peaceful world and not have to pay for it is really coming to an end, because it itself has become big enough to be the target of the United States' attentions. So it's worried now about its own security and about its own capacity to continue to grow and expand, to monopolize certain resources, to command advanced technologies, to command enough power really to frustrate the United States and to change the norms and rules in the way that it wants. So yes, it has benefited, but now it is beginning to be concerned that those benefits no longer apply.
You mentioned earlier that China has little interest in being the global police officer, the role that the United States has kind of found itself lumbered with in the post-World War II era in particular. But is that the reason as well that China, certainly relative to the United States, has seemed so reluctant to embark on military endeavours to further its interests? It looks at what has happened to the United States when it has tried and just thought, God, we don't want any of that.
I think it's partly that. It's an expensive business being the global police person, and China doesn't have the kind of alliances that help to share that expense the way the US has with NATO, for example. But also in terms of military endeavor, it's important to remember that China hasn't really had much practice, and it is a potentially very high risk operation. So the last live war that China actually fought was against Vietnam in the 1970s, and they lost. They called it a self-defensive counterattack, but it was effectively an invasion of Vietnam, and they got a good hiding from the Vietnamese. Since then, they've spent a lot of time and effort upgrading the military, but for a long time, the PLA was essentially a huge infantry. They hardly had a navy, and they didn't have much of an air force. A lot of the infantry was needed to defend the border with Russia, but the infantry was also very corrupt. It had its own business empire, so it wasn't clear that it could really fight. And it hasn't had the kind of experience of the sort of logistical demands involved in overseas deployment. So they've spent a lot of money, a lot of effort, and a lot of time trying to get the Chinese armed forces fit for purpose. They are, for example, one of the biggest contributors to UN peacekeeping. And the purpose of that is to give their troops experience of serving in different environments. And they've built a very big navy because they're a huge global economy and you need to be a maritime power. But I think there's still quite a lot of uncertainty. And the experience of the Russians in Ukraine when they threw the army at a problem and found that, that half the vehicles had no working tires and that kind of thing. The level of corruption and mistrust. I think they're still very uncertain about what would happen if they had to get into a proper fight.
I mean, we have nevertheless seen China chucking its weight around to a limited extent, mostly at the expense of Filipino coast guards. But it's commonly held that one of the things that restrains China in the Pacific especially is the idea of the American counterbalance. This is perhaps cited most often in relation to Taiwan. But is it possible to assess what China might try if it actually got to a point of thinking, well, the Americans don't care and they're not going to stop us?
Well, I think there are two things to look at. One is the sort of quiet taking over of assets that China has practiced for the past, 20 years. If you look at the South China Sea, for example, it's pretty much, a Chinese lake at this point. It's been thoroughly militarized. It's bristling with Chinese armaments. And that was, you could argue that begins as a kind of defensive maneuver because of the Malacca Straits as a choke point for Chinese imports and so on. But it certainly established a very strong strategic position at the expense of all the claimants and all its neighbors in the South China Sea. Then if you look again across the Pacific, look at the relationships that China has built up with a whole series of Pacific islands and look at the ports that China has built. It's building up the capacity to operate, whether it actually needs to do that. It does, at the moment, look as though it's building the capacity both to deny the US its own freedom of maneuver and operations, and to build up its own alliances, if you like. They're not formal alliances, but its own logistical bases. So there's a lot of preparation going on. And if there's no intent to use it, you wonder why they're doing it.
But does China have allies as such in the sense that the United States would think of itself as having those allies, or does China just have clients and vassals?
Yeah, well, I think it's closer to the clients and vassals. I mean, I suppose you would think of Russia now perhaps as the nearest thing to an ally. And certainly you see a lot of joint military exercises going on between the Chinese and the Russians, many of them directed around Japan. You have North Korea, which must be the ally from hell because it's not, they can't get away from each other and sort of nominally they're on the same side. But of course, they're not really on the same side in the sense that the North Koreans deeply resent Beijing and Beijing, it finds the North Koreans very annoying, but there's nothing that either of them can do about that situation. Beyond that, it's very hard to see that China does have allies. It does have smaller countries that it has a lot of influence on. It has countries like Pakistan, where you do have quite a strong security relationship and a lot of Chinese assets that need defending. And I guess in the sense that if you're looking at China's relationship with India and Pakistan's relationship with India, China and Pakistan would be the closest thing to a well-established alliance in that, in the event of a military conflict, they would support each other and do support each other. Beyond that, no, there's no equivalent of NATO or Five Eyes or AUKUS in the Chinese sphere at present.
Just as a closing thought then, it has often appeared, or at least it has been imputed by, I guess, America's admirers and antagonists alike, that the United States has been animated by this idea that the whole world, deep down where it lives, wants to be American or should be American because, they look out a world that loves American literature and music and movies and television and just assumes, everyone wants to be like us, really. The Chinese Communist Party started life as a revolutionary cause, literally so. Do they have that same kind of crusading zeal that has animated the American experiment? Do they want to make the world in China's image?
Well, I'm not sure how much effort they would expend in pursuit of that. But increasingly, we are seeing the Chinese narrative bend in that direction. Until relatively recently, China would criticize the United States for trying to export democracy and force other countries to adopt rules that were made in the United States for the benefit of the United States. So what China now says to the emerging economies, the majority world, if you like, is that, it's time to democratize the global system and that the majority should have a say now, as opposed to certain bullying powers, which is very thin code for the United States. And China, because of its economic success, can also say, look at Western democracies, they're a mess, they're failing. If you want success, look at our system, be our friend. And that's having some resonance, I think, with the majority world, even if people are still suspicious politically of China. And not that many of them particularly want to adopt the Chinese mode of governance. But the fact that China is now the second largest economy, it's a big military power, and in terms of technology, it's going great guns. That is making an impression, certainly compared to Trump's United States.
Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue, thank you for joining us. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.